In a land marked by fear and oppression, when men had given up fighting, a woman stood up. She was not a warrior, she was not queen, she was a prophetess and judge, and with her firm voice and heart full of faith, she turned the tide against the most powerful army of her time. Her name? Deborah. And what she did, to this day, echoes like a cry of courage in the deserts of history. Imagine living in an occupied country where the roads have become traps and the villages have become ghosts. For 20 years, the people of Israel were crushed by the cruel rule of the Canaanites, led by King Jabin and his general Sisera, the owner of 900 iron chariots, war machines that seemed invincible. But it was in this dark scenario that God decided to act through a woman. Deborah not only judged the people's causes in the shade of a palm tree, but also heard the voice of God and had the boldness to obey it. When she calls Barak to war, he hesitates. And that's when the improbable happens. An epic battle is won not with brute force, but with strategy, faith, and even a storm. And the glory of victory, it was not for the warrior, but for two women. You are about to discover a story that challenges everything you imagined about the role of women in the Bible. Deborah, Jael, and even nature came together to free Israel. The book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5, is more than an ancient narrative. It is a reminder that courage can be born when no one expects it, and that when God moves, no empire can resist. So, if you've ever wondered if God could use someone like you, this story will give you an unforgettable answer. In the midst of chaos and widespread oppression, when Israel seemed to have completely lost its way, a figure no one expected appeared. Deborah, a woman. Yes, a woman occupying the highest position of spiritual and civil authority in the nation, judge of Israel and prophetess. This in itself already shattered any expectations in a scenario dominated by male voices. While everyone was paralyzed by fear of the enemy, she was listening to the voice of God, discerning the time and preparing the people for a historic turning point. Deborah did not just judge causes or give spiritual advice. She led with wisdom, sensitivity, and firmness. She sat under her palm tree, which seemed ordinary, but there she gathered crowds thirsty for direction. It was in that simple, open-air space that crucial decisions were made. And perhaps the most curious thing about it all is the contrast. The woman who used her voice as a weapon at a time when silence was imposed on women. She spoke, and the people listened. She commanded, and the people obeyed. It is worth remembering that this female leadership in the Bible does not arise by chance. God didn't choose Deborah because there were no men available. He chose her because he saw in her faith, courage, and spiritual discernment. A powerful lesson for our day. God continues to use unlikely people for extraordinary purposes. And if he called Deborah to lead an entire nation, why wouldn't he call you to lead your home, your company, your generation? Deborah's presence also deconstructs the idea that spiritual leadership is restricted to those who speak loudest or have the most strength. She shows us that true leadership comes from intimacy with God. That was what made her a bridge between heaven and the people. And this explains why she was chosen to hear the divine strategies that would change Israel's fortunes. Deborah is a living example that when God speaks, he doesn't see appearances. He sees the available heart. His story challenges us to this day. How many times do we fail to act because we think we don't have the ideal profile, that we're not the right guy? Deborah reminds us that the right kind is the one who hears God's voice and obeys, even when everything around says it won't work. She was not a warrior with a sword, but she won battles with wisdom and prophetic vision. And that was just the beginning, because the enemy was still lurking and Canaanite oppression was about to be confronted head-on. Imagine living in fear of even leaving the house. This is exactly what Israel faced for 2 decades. Under the rule of King Jabin, a powerful Canaanite ruler, the people were crushed by cruel oppression. The person responsible for the military force was Sisera. his implacable general who maintained control through a frightening war machine, 900 iron chariots, true war tanks of the time. This detail is even repeated with emphasis in the Bible because it symbolized absolute and intimidating power. The roads, once used for commerce and family gatherings, have become too dangerous to travel on. The villages, which were centers of community life, were abandoned. The feeling was of complete helplessness. Israel seemed like a lawless, voiceless, hopeless land. There was no organized army. There were no modern weapons. Just a cornered people, living in the shadow of Canaanite terror. It was like living under constant siege, where each new day was a silent fight for survival. The oppression was not only physical, but also spiritual. The people had strayed from the ways of the Lord, and this departure always has consequences. Oppression and liberation are two recurring themes in the book of Judges, almost like a cycle. The people go astray, fall into the hands of their enemies, cry out to God, and then he raises up a liberator. Only this time, this liberator would not come as a warrior in armor, but as a woman of prayer and vision. Deborah's own choice was already a response to heaven, defying all human conventions. Sisera's iron chariots were not just physical weapons. They represented everything that seemed impossible to overcome: dominant structures, cruel logics, systems that oppress and crush dreams. Perhaps today you are not facing iron cars, but rather debts, illnesses, destroyed relationships, or insecurities that seem invincible. And just like Israel, you too may be waiting for a deliverance that seems too far away. But the scenario that seems final is often the stage for divine intervention. It is in this dark, almost suffocating context that Deborah's figure becomes even more impressive. His courage did not emerge in a time of stability, but in the midst of chaos. Her strength did not come from the sword, but from the certainty that God still spoke, still acted, and still cared. The story takes us to a key moment, the time to react. And that's when the divine call to action comes into play, bringing with it an insecure man, an improvised army, and a plan that would seem crazy if it weren't divine. Amidst the deafening silence of oppression, God spoke, and the one who heard it was Deborah. As a prophetess, she not only judged causes, but also received direct revelations from the Lord. And the message was clear: it was time to act. It was then that she called Barak, son of Abinoam, a military leader from the tribe of Naphtali. The divine instruction was specific: gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and march to Mount Tabor, the strategic location for the battle. The plan came from above. The mission was risky, but the time for liberation had arrived. When Barak heard the order, his reaction was hesitation. He didn't refuse, but he also didn't move forward alone. Said, "If you go with me, I'll go. If you don't go, I won't go." It may seem like cowardice, but it was also a reflection of the chaos in which Israel lived. Barak recognized in Deborah a superior spiritual authority, a woman connected with heaven. And even though it revealed his insecurity, it also demonstrated humility. He did not want to go into combat without the certainty that God would be with them. And Deborah, she agreed right away. But she made something very clear. The glory of victory will not be yours, Barak. The enemy will be delivered into the hands of a woman. This prophecy could have many meanings. Could she be the heroine? Could it be another woman? This was yet to be revealed. The fact is that history was being rewritten with a divine pen, and unlikely characters took on protagonist roles. And see how interesting, even though he was afraid, Barak went. Sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. A great practical lesson for real life, right? Deborah's call to Barak teaches us a lot about leadership, partnership, and obedience. God gave Deborah the vision, but summoned an army through her. Not everyone needs to lead from the front with sword in hand. Some lead with words, others with listening, others with action. And everyone is important in the divine plan. The important thing is that when God calls, the response needs to be, "Here I am." even if trembling, even if with doubts. The important thing is to take the step, like Barak did. This moment marks a decisive turning point in the narrative. The scenario begins to change. Mount Tabor becomes a meeting point, the army is organized, and the divine plan is about to be executed. But there was still a huge wall ahead, Sisera's iron chariots. Everything indicated that Israel would be crushed once again. But whoever looks only with natural eyes does not see what God is already moving in the invisible. And when the enemy thought victory was certain, heaven literally arrived on the scene. The scenario was dramatic. On one side, the improvised army of Israel, led by Barak and encouraged by Deborah. On the other, Sisera, with his overwhelming contingent and the feared 900 iron chariots. They met in the Jezreel Valley, a large terrain ideal for military maneuvers, especially for those with war chariots. But it was right there, where human logic predicted defeat, that heaven began to conspire in favor of faith. And what happens when heaven decides to intervene? The story changes, and it changes in a way that no one expects. As Israel's soldiers advanced, a sudden storm struck the battlefield. It wasn't just rain, it was a divine response. The Kishon, or Sison River, normally shallow, overflowed its banks, turning the land into pure mud. Result, Sisera's iron chariots got bogged down and became useless. What was a symbol of power became a trap. What once caused fear became a reason for hope. It's amazing how God, with something as simple as rain, can dismantle men's most solid strategies. This scene has something cinematic about it. Thunder, lightning, soldiers running, cars stuck in the mud, and an enemy army panicking. Israel, guided by boldness and faith, set out upwards. And what was supposed to be a shameful defeat became a resounding victory. Not because Israel had better weapons, but because it had a just cause and a present God. When there is divine purpose behind a mission, not even the most structured forces can prevail. Victory is a matter of time. And that was exactly what Deborah had prophesied. She knew that this was not just a military war, but a spiritual battle. And in spiritual battles, those who win are those who are aligned with the heavens. Divine intervention was the difference that became the key to Israel's destiny. And do you know what this shows us today? That sometimes God is just waiting for our step of faith to release a rain that transforms everything. But this rain only falls for those who leave their comfort zone and climb the mountain, like Deborah and Barak did. Sisera, seeing the situation collapse, fled on foot, leaving his soldiers and iron chariots behind. The powerful commander now ran desperately, trying to escape divine justice. And the most curious thing, this escape would not be the end of the conflict, but the beginning of an even more surprising turn. Deborah's prophecy was not yet fully fulfilled, because Sisera's fate would not be sealed by warriors on the battlefield, but by a woman, silent, inside a tent. And her name was Jael. While Israel's army celebrated victory and Sisera's iron chariots got stuck in the mud, the powerful general fled, alone and aimlessly. Your destination, a tent in the desert. And the one who received him was Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite, a people allied with both Israel and the Canaanites, a woman who at first glance seemed neutral, harmless, even too kind. But in that unexpected visit, something much bigger was at stake. The fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy that the glory of victory would come through the hands of a woman. Sisera asked for shelter, and Jael offered. He asked for water. She gave milk. He asked for silence, and she offered comfort. Everything looks like hospitality. But Jael wasn't just a casual hostess. She was a woman attentive to the signs of the times. While everyone was waiting for a warrior to finish off the enemy on the field, God would use an ordinary woman with a silent and deadly gesture to end oppression. While Sisera slept, exhausted from the escape, Jael acted with precision and courage. She took a tent peg, a common tool for nomadic women at the time, and drove it into the enemy general's temple. Yes, it is a strong act, shocking even. But it is also symbolic. The enemy who caused so much terror died without glory, without resistance, defeated not by force, but by the strategy and determination of an unlikely woman. Israel's victory was completed with the silence of an invisible blow. God once again showed that he can use whoever he wants, however he wants, wherever he wants. Jael's attitude reveals a different kind of courage. It was not courage on the battlefield, in front of thousands of soldiers. It was a solitary strategic courage that required firmness and decision. She acted alone, without guarantees, but with the conviction that she was on the right side of history. And this type of practical, discreet, and impactful faith is what transforms destinies. Jael went down in history as a heroine of Israel, a woman who heard the right time to act and didn't hesitate. The next day, when Barak arrived at the tent, he found the enemy already defeated. What he could not do on the battlefield, Jael did with a stake. The cycle of prophecy was complete. And this scene marks not only the end of Sisera, but the beginning of a new phase for the people of Israel. But before we celebrate the end of the story, we need to hear the song that was born from this victory, a song that echoes to this day as praise, protest, exhortation, and memory, the song of Deborah. Some victories are so remarkable that they cannot fit into common words. They need to become poetry, and that's exactly what happened after Sisera's defeat. In chapter 5 of the book of Judges, the famous Song of Deborah appears, one of the oldest and most beautiful texts in the Bible. It is not just a song of celebration, but a prophetic, poetic, and profound hymn, which recalls in detail what God did for Israel. There we see faith sung, justice exalted, and collective memory being immortalized in powerful verses. The song begins by praising the involvement of the people and the role of the leaders who rose up for battle. But he also makes a point of criticizing the tribes that failed to act, that stood by while others took risks. It's like a warning that neutrality in times of injustice is also a choice, and a demanding choice. At the same time, Deborah praises those who said yes, even without guarantees. The song is therefore a mix of celebration, confrontation, and memory, a lesson in active faith. One of the most striking moments of the song is when Jael is honored as the most blessed among women. It was unusual for a woman to be so exalted in a war song, but there she was, at the center of the praise. This shows how the song values not only large armies, but also individual gestures driven by courage and purpose. Every action matters, every decision has weight, and when done with faith, it can enter eternity. It is the Bible teaching us that true heroes do not always wear armor. Another curious detail is how the song describes Sisera's mother waiting for her son to return from battle. She imagines him arriving with spoils, as he always did, but he never came back. This image, sad and even ironic, reinforces how divine justice sometimes turns human expectations upside down. Whoever seemed invincible was defeated. Whoever seemed weak was exalted. It is God's signature in history. He confounds the powerful and lifts up the humble. More than an epic story, the song is a lesson for all of us. He invites us to remember, singing, not to forget what God did, naming heroes, celebrating victories with gratitude, recognizing that Israel's liberation did not come from swords alone, but from the union between faith and action, between heaven and earth, between God's command and human obedience. And it is with this spirit of celebration and reverence that the people enter a new phase, a rare and precious time of 40 years of peace. After the clash of swords and the silence of victory came what Israel most longed for, peace, and not for a few days or months, but for 40 years of rest, as reported at the end of chapter 5 of Judges. An entire generation grew up without the weight of Canaanite oppression, without the terror of iron chariots, and without the rule of kings like Jabin. It was a rare, precious time, and built on the courage of those who were willing to act when everything seemed lost. Deborah, Barak, Jael. Their names became symbols of faith that transforms realities. But make no mistake, This peace was not achieved only with victories on the battlefield. It was the fruit of obedience, inspired leadership, and divine intervention. When we look at Deborah's legacy, we don't just see a woman strategist. We see a bridge between heaven and the people, a leader who inspired action, prophesied boldly, and knew how to recognize that the glory belonged to God. She didn't seek applause. His objective was clear: to see Israel free and reconciled with the Lord. And what a powerful lesson we have here. We often seek peace in quick solutions, but the Bible shows us that true peace comes from firm positions. Female leadership in the Bible, represented so powerfully in Deborah, is not a curious detail. It is a declaration from heaven that God empowers whoever he chooses, regardless of gender. What he is looking for are willing hearts, open minds, and a faith that moves. And Deborah, she had all of this in double. It is impossible to look at this history and not think about the practical implications for today. Perhaps your war is not against Canaanites, but against internal pressures, voices that paralyze you, systems that oppress your identity. The message is clear. You don't have to be the strongest to be used by God. You just need to be available. Deborah was neither queen nor warrior, but she heard God's voice and led a nation to liberation. And that's more than inspiring. It's a calling for all of us. Deborah's generation had 40 years of peace because someone had enough faith to act, enough courage to obey, and enough wisdom to trust. And now that we know this entire journey, from oppression to victory, from battle to song, one question remains: what legacy are you building? The story doesn't end here. It continues every time someone dares to believe that the impossible can happen. And the next step, it's understanding what to do with everything we've learned so far. Deborah's story, more than a story of war and victory, is a mirror for each of us. She shows that true leadership doesn't come from title, physical strength, or fame. It comes from the willingness to listen to God's voice and obey, even when everything seems impossible. In a time of silence and fear, Deborah opened her mouth and spoke. In a generation at a standstill, she stood up. And that decision changed the course of an entire nation. Maybe you are experiencing something similar, facing invisible enemies, internal crises, or situations that seem invincible like Sisera's iron chariots. And just like Israel, perhaps you are waiting for someone to rise up. The truth is that God may be calling you right now, not to win by strength of arm, but to act in faith with courage and spiritual sensitivity. Like Deborah, like Jael, like the unlikely ones that make history. And if you feel insecure like Barak, know that God does not demand perfection. He values the heart that recognizes its dependence. What matters is not the size of your strength, but the greatness of your obedience. The courage that transforms is not the one that screams the loudest, but the one that moves even with a racing heart. If God gave you a mission, it is because He Himself prepared the way to victory, even if it starts with timid steps. This story also teaches us to value those who act behind the scenes. Jael, with a simple and decisive gesture, entered eternity. This proves that there is no small role in the kingdom of God. Every act of faith has eternal weight. And now, the question that remains is, will you continue watching from afar, or will you assume the role that God is calling you to live? The story is still being written, and you can be a defining chapter. If this story spoke to you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. And tell me here in the comments, which character inspired you the most, Deborah, Jael, or Barak? Let's continue this conversation. Because when the word becomes alive, it transforms. And when we move with God, even a simple step becomes eternal.